When you're a forest ranger, you see strange things, disappearing campers, odd tracks, eerie sounds in the night. I've always been able to explain them away, until last week, what I saw out there, lurking in the woods, defied explanation, and I think it's only the beginning. Being a forest ranger had always felt like a calling. It wasn't just about the job, it was about the forest itself. There's a kind of peace you find in the wilderness that you can't get anywhere else. No cars honking, no phones buzzing, just the sound of the wind weaving through the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I loved it. For 10 years, I patrolled the same sprawling forest, from its rocky cliffs to its hidden valleys, and I thought I knew every inch of it. I thought I understood its rhythms, its secrets. But I was wrong. The job wasn't always as idyllic as people imagined. There were tough days, storm, damage, trails to clear, the occasional stubborn hiker to rescue, and more lost campers than I could count. But those were the expected challenges. There were other moments, though, when things didn't make sense. Strange sounds in the night, like whispers carried in the wind. Tracks that led nowhere, disappearing into thin air. And then there were the reports, the ones that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A family once told me they'd heard laughter, high, brittle, and unnatural, coming from deep within the woods, even though no one else was supposed to be out there. Another camper swore they'd woken up to find their tent unzipped from the outside, their belongings scattered, with no sign of animals or humans nearby. I'd always found ways to explain these things away. Animals can act oddly, and people, especially when camping, have a tendency to let their imaginations run wild. But lately something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the forest didn't feel the same. The air was heavier, like it was holding its breath. Birds were leaving earlier in the season, their songs replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the deer and rabbits seemed skittish, darting away at the slightest noise. Campers began reporting unnerving silences where not even the buzz of insects could be heard. The tipping point came one brisk autumn morning. I just settled into the ranger station with a cup of coffee when a call came in. 3 campers had gone missing overnight. Their friends had reported them overdue, and no one had seen them leave the forest. At first, I wasn't overly concerned. People got lost all the time, and most of the time, they turned up a few hours later, sheepish and embarrassed. But something about this call gave me pause. The friend on the line said they'd woken up to find the campsite empty, tents ripped open, gear scattered, but no signs of a struggle. I grabbed my pack, checked my flashlight, and set off. I didn't know it at the time, but this wasn't going to be like any other search I'd ever done. I followed the directions given by the friend who'd reported the missing campers. The location was a few miles into the forest, past a narrow trail that hadn't been maintained in years. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Usually, the forest was alive with sound, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the distant rustle of branches, but that day, there was nothing, just the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and the occasional groan of the trees in the wind. When I reached the campsite, the scene stopped me in my tracks. The tents were shredded, their fabric hanging in ribbons like something had clawed through them. Pots and pans lay scattered, some bent as though they'd been struck with great force. Unrolled near the fire pit, its lining torn open, but there was no blood, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just chaos, like the campers had vanished into thin air. I crouched down to inspect the ground, hoping to find some kind of clue. About 10 feet away, I spotted a trail of footprints leading away from the site. They were deep, erratic, like whoever made them had been running. I followed them for about 50 yards before they stopped. Completely. There were no drag marks, no disturbed soil, nothing to indicate where the person had gone. It was as if they'd just disappeared. I turned back toward the campsite, my pulse quickening. As I approached, a movement in the trees caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow shifting where it shouldn't, but then I saw it clearly. It was tall, much taller than any human, with long, angular limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying me. It stood just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its gaze. My breath hitched as it stepped back into the darkness, melting away as if it had never been there. I stood frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer or a bear, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever I'd seen wasn't natural. I radioed back to the station, reporting what I'd found, or rather, what I hadn't found. My supervisor's voice crackled through the static, dismissive. "Probably a bear," he said. "Clean it up, file a report, and move on." But as I packed up the scattered belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I arrived back at the ranger station as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky. With streaks of orange and deep purple, the woods outside the station looked like a solid wall of shadows, impenetrable and foreboding. I was still shaken from what I had seen, those massive claw marks on the trees, the shredded tents, and most of all, the figure that had melted into the shadows. I filed my report, detailing everything I had found at the campsite, but I hesitated when it came to describing the figure. What could I say? Saw a tall, skeletal thing staring at me from the woods. I didn't even believe it fully. My supervisor, Paul, glanced over the report with a kind of casual indifference that comes from years of dealing with hikers who twist their ankles or bears rummaging through trash. "It's a bear," he said flatly, tapping his pen against the desk. "A big one, probably scared off by the campers before it could do more damage." "But the footprints," I said, my voice shaking. "They just stopped. And those claw marks, they're too deep too." I trailed off, knowing how ridiculous I sounded. Paul leaned back in his chair and raised an eyebrow. "You've been out here too long, friend. It's getting to you. File this, clean up what you can tomorrow and move on. No need to make this bigger than it is." I wanted to argue, but his tone left no room for debate. He wasn't going to listen. The next morning, I returned to the site with a wildlife expert named Dana. She was sharp and thorough, her years of experience showing in the way she examined every inch of the campsite. When she ran her fingers over the claw marks on the trees, her confident demeanor faltered. "These don't make sense," she murmured. "No bear does this. And these tracks," pointed at the ground, her face pale. "They're not any predator I've ever seen." "What are they then?" I pressed, my pulse quickening. She shook her head, her voice dropping. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not normal. Be careful out here." Dana didn't stay long. She packed up her equipment quickly, avoiding my gaze, and left without another word. Watching her drive away, I felt an unsettling mix of validation and fear. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just in my head. That night, I sat in my cabin, trying to focus on anything other than the events of the day. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but it wasn't the wind that unnerved me. It was the other sounds. The snapping of branches, the faint rustle of something moving just beyond the tree line. Then came whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. Low, breathy voices that didn't form words but carried a sinister intent. I turned off the lights, crouching by the window with my flashlight in hand. My breath fogged the glass as I peered out into the darkness. A shadow shifted near the edge of the trees, too tall and too thin to be a deer or a bear. My heart pounded as the shadow disappeared, melting into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. The call came in just after dawn. A family that had been camping near the river hadn't returned. As scheduled, their car was still parked in the lot, but there was no sign of them. My stomach churned as I listened to the report. Another disappearance. Paul assigned me to lead the search. A team of 6 rangers armed with maps, radios, and emergency gear set out along the trail toward the river. As we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air was thick, and even the sunlight filtering through the trees felt muted, like the forest was swallowing it. We reached the campsite by mid-afternoon. It was worse than the first. The tents were intact, but everything else was wrong. Symbols had been carved into the surrounding trees, spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that made my eyes hurt if I looked too long. The ground around the fire pit was scorched, the ash giving off a faint metallic smell. Personal items, shoes, backpack, a child's stuffed bear were scattered in a wide circle as though they'd been flung by an invisible force. There were no bodies, no blood, just the overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened here. The team fanned out, searching for clues. I stayed behind, drawn to one of the carved symbols. It looked ancient, yet fresh, as though it had been burned into the bark only hours ago. As I reached out to touch it, a sharp crack echoed through the woods. I spun around, my heart racing. One of the team members, Eric, was gone. His radio lay on the ground. The cord snapped. Splitting off from the group, I followed a faint trail of footprints leading away from the site. My flashlight barely cut through the encroaching shadows. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the forest became. Then I saw it. The creature was hunched over, its elongated limbs folded awkwardly as it studied me. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, radiating malice. The skin stretched over its skeletal frame looked wrong, like it didn't belong to it. It let out a shriek, high-pitched and guttural, that rattled my bones. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my hands. By the time I scrambled to pick it up, the creature was gone, leaving behind nothing but the lingering sound of its scream. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was living in someone else's nightmare. The forest had always been a second home to me, a place of stability and calm, but now it seemed to shift under my feet, as if it no longer wanted me there. At first, the changes were subtle. A trail I'd walked hundreds of times now seemed narrower, the trees pressing closer together. Certain areas that used to buzz with wildlife were eerily silent. Animals that once darted across my path were either gone or behaving in ways I couldn't explain. A family of deer stared at me for what felt like minutes, their unblinking eyes too focused, too intelligent. A lone crow perched on a branch above my cabin, letting out a single, guttural caw that didn't sound like any bird I'd ever heard. Then the forest's defiance became bolder. Paths I'd mapped out years ago, twisted, unexpectedly leading me in circles no matter how carefully I tracked my steps. Landmarks it relied on, an old oak tree, a jagged boulder, vanished or reappeared in different places. Night, as I drove along a familiar dirt road, the headlights of my truck illuminated a tree that hadn't been there the day before, its branches bending as though trying to block my way. I tried to tell my colleagues about what was happening, but they dismissed me. Stress, Paul said, waving me off. You've been overworked. Take a few days off. Dana, the wildlife expert, wouldn't even return my calls. It felt like I was screaming into a void. The station, once my refugee, began to feel like trap. The radios crackled with static even when they were off, and the camera feeds glitched constantly. At night, the wind carried faint whispers. That seemed to come from nowhere. I started hearing footsteps in the hallways when I was alone. One evening, as I sat at the desk, trying to organize my thoughts, I heard the door creak open. My stomach dropped when I saw who it was, or rather, what. It was Hank, one of the oldest rangers, who had retired years ago. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes were clouded with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a heavy secret for too long. He shuffled inside, his boots scraping against the floor, and sat across from me. Without a word, I heard you've seen them, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Seen what? I asked, though I already knew. The Watchers, he said, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. They've always been here. Long before us, long before this forest had a name. He told me about an incident from decades ago when a similar series of disappearances had plagued the area. Rangers had gone missing one after another until Hank was the only one left. They thrive on fear, he said, his voice hollow. And they don't just take people. They take the forest too. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward. You've noticed it, haven't you? The trees, the animals, the paths, they're not ours anymore. They belong to them, and they're not going to stop until everything does.
He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving me with more questions than answers. But one thing
Was clear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't going to stop. I knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty. Whatever was in the forest, whatever had taken those campers and twisted the woods into something unrecognizable, I had to face it, if not to stop it, then, at least to understand it. Armed with a flashlight, a journal, and every ounce of courage I could muster, I ventured into the restricted zone. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to resist me. The air grew colder, the trees tighter, their branches forming a near impenetrable canopy. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, and every step felt heavier, as though the earth itself was trying to hold me back. After hours of hiking, I stumbled into a clearing unlike anything I'd ever seen. The ground was etched with massive symbols, spirals, and jagged lines that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly glow. The air buzzed with a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in my chest. At the center of the clearing was a pit, shallow but wide, filled with what looked like blackened roots. They writhed and twisted like living things, their movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't look away. Then I heard it, the shriek. It was high-pitched and guttural, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. I turned just in time to see it, the creature from before, its skeletal form illuminated by the glow of the symbols. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of them emerged from the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They moved in unison, their limbs bending in impossible ways, their movements both fluid and jerky. It hit me then. They weren't just hunting, they were protecting something. The pit, the symbols. This was their domain, and I had trespassed. The ground beneath me began to shake as the creatures closed in. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. One of them reached out, its bony fingers inches from my face, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, crashing through the forest as the creatures shrieked behind me. The symbol glowed brighter, their hum turning into a deafening roar. It felt like the entire forest was alive, chasing me, trying to pull me back. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't stop to look back. I slammed the door, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road, the headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing at the edge of the forest, their glowing eyes watching as I disappeared into the night. The forest roared behind me as I slammed the truck door shut and twisted the key in the ignition. My hands trembled so violently that I almost dropped the keys, but the engine roared to life, drowning out the inhuman shrieks that echoed from the trees. The night, revealing the dirt road ahead, and I floored the gas pedal. In the rearview mirror, they stood at the edge of the forest, their glowing eyes like embers, floating in the dark, their limbs twisted unnaturally, bending in ways no living thing should be able to. They didn't follow, but they didn't need to. I could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating, even as the truck barreled down the road, kicking up clouds of dust. I didn't stop driving until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. When I finally pulled over, my chest was heaving, and my hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. I stumbled out of it, the truck collapsing onto the side of the road. The morning air was crisp and quiet, but it didn't comfort me. The forest wasn't done with me. The next few days were a blur. I packed up what little I owned and left my cabin, abandoning everything that tied me to that place. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't say goodbye. I just drove as far as my truck would take me, hoping distance could sever the connection. But it followed me. At first, it was subtle, a shadow lingering in the corner of my vision, the faint rustling of leaves. When there was no wind, I told myself it was paranoia, my mind playing tricks on me after the ordeal, but the signs grew bolder. One night, as I tried to sleep in a dingy motel, I woke to the sound of branches scratching against the window. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as though something outside was trying to get my attention. When I finally mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there, just the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. I thought I was losing my mind until I saw the symbol. It was carved into the motel door, the same jagged spiral I'd seen in the clearing, fresh, deep, and unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I traced it with my fingers. They'd found me. I quit my job as a ranger. I moved to the city, far from any forests, but it didn't matter. The nightmares came every night, dark trees closing in, the glow of their eyes in the shadows, and that unholy shriek reverberating in my skull. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight with the weight of an invisible presence. I started noticing the whispers, faint but persistent. They followed me through the crowded streets, slipping through the noise of car horns and chatter.
At first, I couldn't make out the
Words, but now I hear them clearly. They're calling my name. It's not just me. I've been watching the news, piecing together fragments of strange disappearances across the country. Hikers vanishing without a trace, campers leaving behind eerily similar symbols at their sites. It's spreading. Whatever I encountered in that forest, it's not confined to those trees anymore. Last night, I woke up to find my apartment bathed in an unnatural glow. A figure stood in the doorway, impossibly tall, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before fading into the shadows. Now I'm writing this as a warning, though I doubt it will make a difference. These things, these watchers, don't just hunt in the forest. They're patient. They wait for you to slip, to let fear take hold. And once they've marked you, they never let go. If you ever find yourself in the woods and the silence feels too loud, leave. Don't look back. Don't try to understand it. There are things in this world we were never meant to see, let alone face. If you dare, share this story, but be warned, every time it's retold, the watchers take notice. They listen. They learn. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this? Or is something waiting for you just out of sight? The shortcut through the mountains was desolate, silent, and unnerving, the kind of road where even your own thoughts seem louder than the hum of your engine. I hadn't seen another car for miles, just the winding asphalt disappearing into the darkness ahead. Then I saw her, a woman, crouched by the roadside, her shoulders shaking as if she was crying, obscured her face, and she didn't look up as my headlights swept over her, stopping to help. Seemed like the right thing to do, the only thing to do, but as I pulled over, a strange chill ran down my spine and I realized, far too late, that I wasn't alone on that road. Something was terribly wrong. I've always been the type of person who takes the easiest route, even if it's not the safest. That night, I was driving back from a long day at a family gathering. I had stayed too late, laughed too hard, and drank too much coffee to keep myself awake for the drive. The highway was packed, and I couldn't stomach the idea of sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic all night. Then I remembered something. My cousin had once told me about a shortcut through the mountains, a narrow road that cut the drive time in half. It wasn't the most well-maintained route, but I figured I could handle it. What could go wrong? The shortcut started off easy enough. The road wound through the base of the mountains, hugging the curves of the rocky terrain. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional cluster of dry shrubs. There were no streetlights, no signs, and no other cars. At first, I didn't mind. The quiet was almost peaceful, but as I climbed higher into the mountains, something changed. The road narrowed, the trees pressed closer, and the night grew darker. Even my favorite music, blasting from my car's speakers, couldn't drown out the growing unease in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was late, and the isolation of the road was a stark contrast to the crowded highways I was used to. But as I rounded a sharp curve, I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, some illusion cast by my headlights. a pale figure, crouched by the side of the road, barely visible against the jagged rocks and dark foliage. Slowed the car, squinting to make out what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, and as the beams of my headlights swept over it, my stomach knotted. It was a woman, sitting on the edge of the asphalt with her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her long, dark hair hung down like a curtain, almost brushing the ground, hiding her face completely. Her shoulders were trembling, jerking in a way that made it clear she was crying, or at least mimicking someone crying. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake. Every instinct in me screamed to keep driving, to pretend I hadn't seen her. Something about her posture, the way she seemed completely out of place on this empty mountain road, sent a ripple of unease through me. But what if she was hurt? What if she was stranded out here, miles from anyone who could help her? The thought of leaving her there, alone and vulnerable, clawed at my conscience. I took a deep breath and pulled the car to the side of the road, the tires crunching on loose gravel. I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to let my voice carry. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound calm, like I wasn't already imagining 1,000 scenarios in my head. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Her sobs grew louder, echoing faintly off the trees and rocks, like the sound didn't belong to her alone, but to the entire surrounding forest. I leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Ma'am," I called out again, louder this time. "Do you want me to call someone? Are you hurt?" Still, no answer. Her shoulders kept shaking, her sobs sharp and erratic. The sound cut through the quiet of the mountains, too loud, too raw. The air in the car felt colder somehow, and a prickling sensation crept up the back of my neck. I glanced around instinctively, scanning the shadows beyond the road, searching for anyone, or anything else. The trees stood silent, their black shapes stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The only movement was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Turning back to the woman, I felt a pang of unease I couldn't explain. My hand hovered over the darker handle, unsure if I should get out or not. Before I could decide, something shifted. She stopped crying. The silence that followed wasn't like the peaceful quiet of the forest. It was heavy, oppressive, like the entire mountain had been holding its breath. She sat perfectly still now, not a single tremor or sound escaping her. Slowly, too slowly, she tilted her head just slightly toward me, her hair parting ever so slightly to reveal a barest glimpse of her pale face. "Ma'am," I said again, my voice trembling. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned closer to the window, trying to make out her features in the dim light. That's when I saw it, or rather, I didn't. There was no face, or if there was, it wasn't human. Her skin was smooth and pale, almost waxy, like a mannequin left in the cold for too long. Her eyes were dark, sunken pits, and her mouth was just slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too uneven. "Have you seen him?" she asked, her voice low and hollow. It sounded distant, like the words didn't come from her, but from somewhere far behind her, dragged across the air like an echo. I froze, my mind racing. "Seen who?" I managed to stammer, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. She didn't reply, her head tilted further, an unnatural movement that made a faint crackling sound, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. Her mouth stretched into a crooked grin, her jagged teeth glinting faintly in the light. That was enough for me. My hand shot to the gear shift, and I fumbled to put the car into drive. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but my hands trembled so much I struggled to shift the lever. She stood up. Her movements were jerky and wrong, like a puppet being yanked upright by invisible strings. Her arms dangled at her sides, her head tilting further as she took one deliberate step toward the car. My heart thundered in my chest as I slammed the gear into drive and pressed the gas pedal. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, and the car lurched forward, its headlights cutting a swath of light across the empty road ahead. In the rearview mirror, I could see her standing in the middle of the road, her dark, empty eyes locked on me. Her grin never wavered, even as her figure faded into the darkness behind me. but as I rounded the next curve, my heart nearly stopped. She was there, ahead of me, standing in the same pose in the same spot, as though she'd been waiting for me the entire time. The silence was deafening. She sat perfectly still, her head tilting slightly to the side, like she was listening for something. I leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Do you need help?" I repeated, my voice shaking. Slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her hair shifted just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face, or what should have been her face. Her skin was pale and smooth, too smooth, like porcelain. Her eyes were dark, empty pits, and her mouth hung slightly open, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. "Have you seen him?" she asked. Her voice was low and hollow, like it came from somewhere deep inside her. My breath caught in my throat. "Seen who?" She didn't answer, her head tilted further, her body twitching as though she were a puppet, being jerked by invisible strings. I didn't wait for her to respond. Something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong. My hand fumbled for the gear shift, and I slammed the car in reverse, the tires squealing as I backed away from her. That's when she stood up. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a broken toy winding to life. She took a step toward me, then another. Her head snapped to the side, and her mouth stretched into a grin so wide it shouldn't have been possible. The car jolted as I threw it into drive. I sped down the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the middle of the road, her dark eyes locked onto mine. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, shadows moved in the trees, tall, gangly shapes that didn't look human. They emerged from the darkness, their limbs too long, their bodies twisting unnaturally. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the car hurtled down the mountain road. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing like a drum in my ears. The road twisted and turned, the sharp curve threatening to send me careening off the edge. My headlights flickered, and for a moment, everything went black. When the lights came back on, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road, impossibly far ahead. I swerved, the tires screeching as I narrowly avoided her. The car skidded to a stop, and I slammed it into reverse, only to find myself facing the same curve I'd just taken. The road had looped. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't real." But it was. Somehow I made it out of the mountains. To this day, I don't remember how. One moment, I was trapped on that endless, twisting road, and the next, the faint glow of city lights broke through the suffocating darkness. It felt like surfacing after being held underwater too long. Gasping for air, my lungs burning, my thoughts clouded. I pulled into my driveway just as the first hint of dawn began to creep across the sky. My hands trembled so badly I struggled to turn the key in the ignition to kill the engine. When I finally managed, the silence of the morning pressed down on me. But it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. The scratches on my car were the first thing I noticed, long jagged marks etched deep into the paint, clawing down the side of the vehicle like something had tried to tear it open. My heart skipped a beat, the memories of that night flooding back in sharp detail. The woman, the road, the shadows. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the house, locking the door behind me and turning on every light in the living room. For a while, I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head. Exhaustion, too much caffeine, the isolation of that cursed road. It had to be a hallucination, right? But no amount of logic could explain the scratches on the car, and no amount of denial could erase what happened that night. It wasn't over. At first, it was subtle. I'd hear faint sobbing outside my bedroom window late at night, soft and broken, almost human, but not quite. The sound was distant at first, muffled like it was carried on the wind, but each time it grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right outside the glass. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the events of the mountains had left me jumpy and paranoid, but then the footprints appeared. One morning, I woke to find muddy footprints on my porch. They weren't mine. They were small, barefoot, leading in a trail that stopped just outside my bedroom window. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something else. Scratched into the wooden frame of the window was a single word. Why? Why? The following days blurred together in a haze of fear. I stopped leaving the house unless I absolutely had to, and even then, I felt like I was being followed. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't, and every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A tall figure, her hair hanging over her face, standing too still to be human. It wasn't just outside. I began hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, soft and deliberate, like someone pacing just outside my bedroom door. Once, I worked up the courage to look. I cracked the door open, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw nothing, just the empty hallway bathed in the faint glow of the nightlight I'd plugged in to keep the darkness at bay. But I wasn't alone. The final straw came 3 nights ago. I woke suddenly, the faint sobbing outside louder than ever before. My body froze as I realized it wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from inside the house. The sound was soft at first, just a gentle weeping from somewhere downstairs. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, rising into wails of anguish that echoed through the walls. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, only to find the screen wouldn't turn on. Dead. That's when I heard it, the faint creak of the floorboards at the bottom of the stairs. "Why didn't you help me?" a voice rasped. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, cutting through the sobbing like a blade. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The floorboards creaked again, the sound climbing the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. And then it stopped. Right outside my door. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sobbing was gone, replaced by the chirping of birds outside. But the marks weren't gone. The scratches on the window frame were deeper, and now there was another word carved below the first: stay. Now, I don't take shortcuts. I don't drive at night, and I certainly don't stop for anyone by the side of the road. But even that hasn't been enough. She's still here, in the shadows of my house, and the silence between breaths. If you ever find yourself on an empty road and see a woman crying, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Whatever she's waiting for, it isn't your help. And if you hear crying at night, check the window. Are you sure it's coming from outside, or is she already inside, waiting for you to break the rules? If you dare, share this story, but be warned. Every time it's retold, she grows closer. The next knock on your door, the next shadow in the corner of your room. It might just be her. Are you sure you're safe as you finish reading this? Or is she already watching from the darkness?